Welcome to the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and today we are getting a little political. Something we don't normally do on this podcast, but we are talking about this vast and very powerful natural resource that we have here in North America that is so important to agriculture, to shipping, to natural water and our drinking water and all that stuff. So it's a very, very important thing that we have here. And we are going to be talking to our guest today who literally wrote the book on this topic, Peter Annin, which I hopefully said his name right. I think I messed it up a couple times, but I'm pretty sure that's the right pronunciation. He wrote a book called The Great Lake Water Wars. And Peter joins us to talk about some of the political standings of it, how important the Great Lakes are, and why it's something that potentially both Canada and the U.S. could be fighting for if things got nasty, which in today's world, who knows, right? What'll happen. So that is all on the way. But first, before we get into that, at the top of this episode, we'll also have a little message from Bill. So those who have been following Bill will know that there was a big storm here in Bonfield, Mattawa area. It caused a lot of destruction, a lot of devastation, and did a lot of damage to the Ecology Center and Samuel de Champlain Park, which is obviously a very a core piece of this podcast and core piece of Bill. So the reason this episode's out a little bit later, it's not in the morning, it's in the later afternoon, was because we spent today, he did come in, by the way, and we did 3 episodes this morning. So it was great therapy for him to be able to get out of the park and come here and do this. And I also wanted to give him the opportunity to share a message. So there's a quick little message in there from Bill, kind of giving you an update. He does thank everyone for their outpouring of love and messages that he's gotten. And it's been great having this platform that I've been able to get closer to him and really, really be able to count him as a friend. And it was hard to see, a lot of the stuff that happened there and how he's hurting, but he is starting to heal. And so he has a couple of words that he's going to have at the top of this episode following a word from today's lead sponsor, the North Bay Regional Health Center Foundation.
Dear North Bay, as a single mom and full-time student, life can feel overwhelming and budgets are always tight. But one thing I never question is how deeply I care about my community. When I began volunteering at the North Bay Regional Health Center, I saw firsthand how much the healthcare system means to people, especially when life takes an unexpected turn. It made me think, what if it was my child, my parent, or my friend that was in need of care? That's when I realized I wanted to do more, to be part of something bigger than myself. I joined the I Give monthly club because even a small monthly gift can have a meaningful impact, helping ensure everyone in our community has access to the care they need right here at home. If you believe in strong, local health care, I hope you'll join me. Sign up at nbrhcfoundation.ca or call 705-495-8125. It's simple and it matters. With gratitude, Kim Cosgrove.
All right, so we're going to get into the episode with Peter in just a moment, but of course, if you're in the area, if you follow Bill on socials, you kind of are aware a little bit of the big storm that went through on Saturday, Saturday evening-ish, and we just wanted to quickly do a little bit of an update. We did do about 3 episodes today. This is the day that this episode's coming out. And Bill, just you wanted to say a couple words about what happened.
Yeah, well, I was in the park. I was in a cabin when that weather event came through and tree came through the roof and total devastation of the park. The park is flattened and the Ecology Center has significant damage. The park will remain closed for probably till next year, the Ecology Center for many months. We're all right, even in the park. I mean, there was some injuries. It was miraculous that no one died, and touch wood for sure. We'll continue to operate. Thank you to the hundreds and hundreds of people that have reached out to send us, good vibes. And so we have a new mantra now. It's not what the park and the Canadian Ecology Center was. It's all about what the park and the Canadian Ecology Center will be. And we will, those that want to come and volunteer or give money in the future, will stay tuned to CanadianEcology.ca. That's Canadian Ecology, all one word, .ca. And nature gives and takes, and there will be both a park and a Canadian Ecology Center as we go forward with our thoughts.
Yep. So our thoughts, of course, are with you here at Echo, and keep your eye on the Backroadsville podcast, because we will be doing, it's great therapy for you to be able to talk to these people. We have a lot of great episodes coming up. And also keep your eye out for fundraisers or other ways that we can use our platform to help get everybody back on their feet. So without further ado, here is today's episode with Peter and the Great Lake Water Wars. Well, today on the program, we're pleased to have in Peter Annin on the show. He is a investigative journalist, a professor of journalism, and the author of a couple of books, mostly what we're going to be talking about today, the Great Lake Water Wars. Peter, welcome into the Backroadsville podcast.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for the kind invitation.
And the reason Peter's on here, Ben, is, because of this book right here, it had a profound kind of impact on myself when I don't know why I had missed it in my travels, but nonetheless, then I started reading it, and chapter 6 in particular talks about Northern Ontario, and we're gonna get into that. But for the listeners and the viewers, the Great Lakes are surrounded, but in the book, Peter, I think you say about 40 million. It's probably about 50 million people now that rely on the Great Lakes. And when you look at the global scale, these are the largest freshwater lakes in the world. They stick out on maps, so you can even see it in the background just above Peter's head. And so it's this book has so many interesting, I think, and impactful topics, and that's what we're going to talk to. And Peter is an award-winning journalist. He's a professor, teaches journalism. He was a reporter for Newsweek. He covered the Branch Davidian standoff in Waco, Texas, and also the Oklahoma City bombing. And so my first question, I thought, after I picked up the book, and I thought, well, we're going to have to try to get Peter on the Backroadsville podcast. How did you fall in love with water and the Great Lakes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And basically for almost a decade, I kind of specialize in these big breaking news stories. Like you said, Waco, Oklahoma City bombing, a lot of plane crashes and shootings and things like that. And after a while, I kind of burned out on that, and I asked my editors if I could focus more on the environment. I'd always written about the environment, and I moved to the Chicago bureau from the Houston bureau. It's right overlooking Lake Michigan, my office, and that's when we had this proposal from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, from the NOVA group to send tankers of pristine Lake Superior water to Asia and try to kind of make money, if you will, on international export of Great Lakes water. And that just really hooked me in. And so I really started focusing extensively my reporting, my coverage. And over time, it just occurred to me that, this isn't just a news story. This is a book. It's so complicated. It's so rich. It's binational. 2 Canadian provinces, you got 8 Great Lakes states, and trying to work all that out. How do you manage and protect 20% of all the fresh surface water on the face of the planet, right? It's really remarkable and rich. And of course, all the First Nations and the tribes on the U.S. side, wow, you had a lot going on there. And so, yeah, I tried to wrap my arms around that and throw it into 300 pages or so in the book. And so thanks for the kind words, Bill.
Well, it's more than a metaphor when we talk about, the wars, because in the book, you go out of your way to talk about we're going from oil to water. And maybe again, for the listeners and the viewers, explain that, because really that's the crux of the matter when we look at this around the world, never mind just in the Great Lakes.
Yeah, so the book really starts out by saying the 20th century was a century of oil, which means arguably you could make the case that it was the defining natural resource of the last century. And what I argue in this book is that water will replace oil by the end of this century that we're in now as the defining global natural resource. And if you have 20% of that of fresh surface water here in the Great Lakes region, the people in the Great Lakes region kind of need to wake up. They need to recognize the global significance of the waters that they have here in this region, and they need to work and be really vigilant about protecting that natural resource as we enter this era of increasing global water insecurity. And of course, much of that water insecurity is climate-driven these days.
Well, give us a good example, and it's probably the Illinois example, where water is being diverted away. Because when we come to the Northern Ontario example, it's completely opposite. We're diverting water into the Great Lakes. But let's look at diversion away and some of those impacts.
Yeah, so it turns out that Canadians and Americans over the last 200 years have done a lot of poking and prodding in the Great Lakes watershed. And so if you think of the Great Lakes watershed, a lot of people don't understand what that means, but it's sort of, think of it like a soup bowl rim that surrounds the Great Lakes, and rainfall, snowfall, and groundwater recharge that occurs within that soup bowl rim is the secret to water sustainability in the Great Lakes region. And there have been numerous pokes and prods in that soup bowl rim by both on the Canadian and the U.S. side of the watershed. Some of them have been big, some of them have been small, some of them have been takers, and as you point out, we're going to talk about more. Some of them have been givers, putting water into the Great Lakes watershed. Sort of the biggest, baddest, most controversial one is in the city of Chicago. And, you know, why is this here? You go back to the late 1800s, Chicago has the Great Chicago Fire, torches much of the downtown area, it embarks this effort to rebuild itself, it becomes this booming metropolis of 1 million people out on the prairie, and it's growing so fast that its water infrastructure can't keep up. You have huge stockyards on the south side that are hard to imagine today. You had all the waste from those animals being washed into the Chicago River while they were waiting to be slaughtered. Then you have all the slaughterhouse waste washed in the Chicago River, and then you have these giant sewage slicks washing out after storm events into Lake Michigan, getting really close to Chicago's water intake structures, which are still visible today 2 miles offshore. So the city started to have health issues, started to become really paranoid about major cholera outbreaks and everything else. It embarks on this Panama Canal-like engineering project to lower the grade in the upper stretch of the Chicago River. And we're talking late 1800s now. 8,000 people worked on this for many, many years, and they reversed the flow of the Chicago River, so Lake Michigan water flows backwards right through downtown Chicago. You go down to the Michigan Avenue Bridge, look down, it's pristine, beautiful, aquamarine, not your muddy urban stream that you see in other areas. That's because it's Lake Michigan water going backwards into the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal that's known today. Then it ends up into the Des Plaines River, the Illinois River, the Mississippi River. So in the late 1800s, Chicago decided to flush its toilet to St. Louis. And it was not a popular decision in Missouri, which filed suit. Then almost all the other Great Lakes states filed suit to try and shut it down. They were unsuccessful in shutting it down, but they were successful in reining in this diversion, cutting it back under the Supreme Court decree of 1967 to 2.1 billion gallons per day. 2.1 billion gallons of Lake Michigan water flows to the Gulf of Mexico every day through the city of Chicago, and it is seen as the poster child of bad behavior when you come to the Great Lakes water diversion, water quantity controversy.
Yeah, and people just don't know much about this. I mean, whether either side of the border, which I'm really glad you mentioned the Panama Canal, because when we go to Chapter 6 in Northern Ontario, Ben, we think about water leaving the Great Lakes, as I said earlier, but here in Northern Ontario, we have two mammoth, they were mega projects back in the 1930s in particular that diverted water. And Peter's going to talk about that. First of all, how did you discover that? I mean, when you dive into research, you're obviously going to come across this, because I didn't know anything about it. I knew about Long Lac and I knew about Ogoki kind of, but not until I read the book. And I thought, and then of course I had to most recently went to both projects, and I have my own opinions and written about it because of the book and because of Peter. But when you first stumbled upon that, I guess, what did you think about that? Because here's a whole different situation.
Yeah, well, the people in Chicago love these Northern Ontario diversions because they make up for all Chicago's sins. They actually put in more water than the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago take out. But yeah, so the International Joint Commission, we should just probably introduce that organization. It's a fascinating organization founded in 1909 by the federal governments of Canada and the United States to resolve transboundary water disputes between the United States and Canada, all along the U.S.-Canada border, not just in the Great Lakes region. So we're talking about BC, Alberta, all that, the Columbia River in the west, and all the way to the Maritimes in the east, et cetera. And so, and the International Joint Commission has studied all of these water diversions in the Great Lakes region, and they publish a map that shows all of these, the poking and prodding that I talked about. And the biggest water diversion of them all, in or out, is the Ogoki diversion in northern Ontario, which puts in, again, I'm not using metric numbers here. I should have done some translation there of that. But anyway, 4,000 cubic feet per second. So it's much larger than the Chicago diversion, Ogoki alone, and putting water into the north shore of Lake Superior. And again, we get into more of the details later. That's not even counting Long Lake or Long Loch, which is right next door.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, having gone up there, Ben, how they do this, because we talked about the height of land before and water going to the Arctic oceans, James Bay, Hudson Bay, and then the water going to the Great Lakes. And so what they have to do, engineering, I mean, it's amazing engineering nonetheless. They kind of make two dams. In one case, they had to make a reservoir, and the other one that was just such a long canal-like structure in Long Lake. The lake already existed. But anyway, the one dam at one end, it's wider than the Hoover Dam in the United States. And it's an incredible. And of course, the shot you took from the plane, I bet you were kind of gobsmacked the day you took that picture.
I absolutely was. No, I mean, you can hear about things, but when you see them, and it's in a roadless area. I mean, there's this giant dam, right? These were ice road truckers who built this stuff, right? And in the middle of the winter, which, those are some pretty brutal winters you have in northern Ontario, right? So these are some tough cookies who are building this stuff. And I agree, it's an engineering marvel. You in a float plane, you're an old, de Havilland Beaver, and you're flying over the bush, right? You are in the middle of nowhere, and then boom, here is this huge dam and a massive reservoir, blocking off the once robust Ogoki River, part of the Albany River system, and as you point out, the James Bay, Hudson Bay watershed.
Yeah, and two things come to mind, and we're going to talk about it. There were no consultation back in the day, and these were kind of the Great Depression of 1929, the fall of our economic well-being into the dirty 30s, as it was called. So at Long Lac, or I get around to Long Lac First Nation in a moment, but White Sands First Nation at the north end of Lake Nipigon, the water level, and Peter's already noted it rises. I'm going to get this wrong too, kind of in inches and percentages, but I think it's about 3% and so many inches in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and Lake Superior that it brings up this by the diversion and later. But in White Sands First Nation, the amount of erosion on the banks, they had to move the community. That's how much it is. But maybe talk about the lack of and of course in the book, and you've got somebody quoted here, this would never happen again.
Right. Yeah, no, it wouldn't. And they're basically, both of these projects were emergency projects in their own way. Starting chronologically, Long Loch was smaller but came first. And you had a situation where, as you mentioned, you had the dirty 30s, you had a really, really severe job situation and all throughout North America. And so you also had demand for pulp and paper on the U.S. side. So paper companies in the United States cut a deal with the Ontario officials to clear-cut vast swaths of northern Ontario, and then they created the Long Loch diversion as a log run to run those logs down into the northern Lake Superior, where they were then rafted and tugged to markets in the United States. So it was really a jobs program, what we would have kind of called the United States the Work Progress Administration, or WPA, under FDR, to get jobs going. And it was an emergency jobs program. And it was successful in that regard in creating jobs both in northern Ontario and in the United States. The clear-cutting wide swaths of boreal forest in northern Ontario is not necessarily, again, what we would necessarily recommend happening today. But that does also continue in its own right. Ogoki was even a bigger emergency. And so as part of the Commonwealth, Canada enters World War II earlier than the United States, and its industrial war machine was really taxing the electrical grid in that sort of Toronto, London, Ontario, that kind of industrial zone of southern Ontario there. And we had brownouts in Toronto while the Canadian military trying to build up the war machine, and they needed electricity there. And they had excess generation capacity on the St. Lawrence in southern Ontario. And so if they could get more water into the system, they would get more power right where they needed it in southern Ontario. And so they come up with this giant Ogoki diversion, which is to back up the Ogoki River, push that water down through the Lake Nipigon system, as you talked about already. And they collected that hydropower on the way at the Sioux and elsewhere. But the real goal, and there was a treaty between the United States and Canada for Canada to collect that extra hydro power in southern Ontario on the St. Lawrence system, and again it worked. It worked. It brought electricity to southern Ontario at an emergency time, but again there were clear environmental costs and then of course social costs that you've looked at already.
Yeah, and Ben, there could have been, and Peter will talk about this, it'll never come to be, but back in the day, even earlier, they thought about creating a 6th Great Lake northwestern Ontario. Maybe, Peter, just talk a bit about that, how the thinking was then that we'll just flood everything, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that this is sort of the heyday of the dam building era, right? And they have the big dams, like, Hoover was, I think, the real big first one that captivated everybody's attention. And then you had more and more in the United States, you had more and more in Canada. And then you had these really gargantuan ideas. One is this one that you're talking about in Northwest Ontario. There's also one called the Grand Canal, which I talk about in the book, which was this really just mind-boggling idea to put a dam sort of across the middle of James Bay and then let the large Arctic streams in northern Ontario and Quebec turn that into a freshwater system instead of a saltwater system, and then canal that water down to northern Lake Huron, thereby making the St. Mary's River outflow from Lake Superior superfluous. And then we're going to push that water out to the Canadian prairies, but ultimately down to the American Southwest, et cetera, et cetera. All these projects eventually fell under their own fiscal and environmental weight. And we're just right at the beginning, the seminal moments of the environmental movement in North America and things like that. And so it was just ridiculous from a money standpoint, ridiculous from an environmental cost standpoint. But it was that we just keep going bigger and bigger and bigger with our dams at that time. And that sort of was the beginning of the end of that big dam building era.
Schools are officially winding down. The last of the exams are being written, and summer is here for everybody, not just in the weather, but also for the schools. And that means relaxing, enjoying the great heat that we've been having, the great sunshine with your sunscreen, of course. You don't want to get sunburnt like I do, and all of the outdoor activities that go along with that. And what better place to check out that than going to your local source for sports here in North Bay, as Paul and his team do a great job having anything for whatever you need, whether it's sports or outdoor activities. It could be gearing up for golf and trying to get help you a little bit in your golf game. Might not lower your handicap too much, but a little bit of help never hurts anybody. If you're looking for some apparel or balls or training gear, which I'm sure a lot of people need. You could also, maybe you're getting ready to play pickleball. Huge sport here in North Bay, and they have all the gear for that as well. And you could also be, I know it's already summer, but you could be thinking about the fall, the winter, trying to get a head start on things like football, gear, hockey, stuff like that. It's a perfect time to go in and see what kind of clearance and good deals that they have going on. I know when I bought my baseball cleats, I got hooked up with a really good set of clearance price. I think I paid maybe $50 for a new pair of cleats, where they usually go for 100 to 150. So go in there, talk to their staff. They're absolutely fantastic. They have, again, almost anything that you need from a sports standpoint, and they're really passionate about sports. They know pretty much anything you need to know. They're going to help you. And it's something that sometimes can be lacking in today's world from the retail sense. Source for Sports really goes back to the core of being passionate about what they sell, and they do a fantastic job doing it. And of course, they're a huge advocate for our community as well. We just did the One Kids Place Golf for Kids tournament. Paul sponsored a hole there. We were there shooting stuff with the Junior A, the U18 Junior A Lakers and their team, and we did some great stuff here on the Echo standpoint. And again, if there's a sporting event, there's a good chance that Paul's attached to it. So they do a great job of advocacy here in the community as well. So the next time you need anything sports related, go into Source for Sports. It's at 1321 Fisher Street, and you will make sure you find what you need to get on your way.
Hey North Bay, it's time to celebrate. The city is turning 100, and Homewood Suites by Hilton North Bay invites you to the party. Be at home in our spacious suites, each featuring a kitchen. Yeah, a real kitchen. Also, enjoy our comfy living spaces and brand new fitness gear so you can keep feeling great while staying on budget. Planning a big bash or business event? We've got the perfect meeting spaces right here on site. Plus, with our partnerships at The Grand and Stock Transportation, your guests and delegates are in great hands. Want to know the best part? We're right beside the beautiful Cape Paceway, steps to North Bay's lively waterfront, and moments from downtown's shopping, dining, and entertainment. Celebrate the Centennial with us all year long with an exclusive discount. Just use the code Centennial when booking your stay. Be at home with Homewood Suites by Hilton North Bay. Join the party today at 495 Oak Street West or call us at 705-495-3000.
And now what we're seeing, and certainly in Canada and Northern Ontario, we're seeing micro dam projects involving First Nation communities because you could talk about clean power, but we're still seeing that urge to dam up waterways and make reservoirs and create power. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I want to bring things to a place that journalists love, which is political a little bit, which is always like the favorite thing. First thing I wanted to know, just from a political standpoint, because one of the things just on the website, on the Great Lake Wars.com, the very first thing is talking about, Trump targeting Great Lakes. So I guess the first question, just for the listeners and everybody, is when it comes to who owns the Great Lakes, where does that property, what's the political situation there?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, and of course, your listeners are going to wonder this, I consider myself to be one of the last nonpartisan journalists in North America. So I don't have an axe to grind with anybody, and I hold everybody to the same standard. So that's number one. They're going to want to know where I'm coming from. And that's where I really feel that we're losing that impartiality that's so important to quality journalism, especially investigative journalism. So, and the federal governments ultimately own those water rights. And then through different projects and programs in the United States anyway, they can sort of defer those rights to the states, but it's mainly the federal governments, and then in certain circumstances the provincial governments in Canada that own those rights. And that's why they create the International Joint Commission to help the federal governments work out these water rights agreements. And then what you're referring to earlier in this year, when Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump was making these really kind of alarming remarks about Canada, super alarming remarks about Canada. And he was trying to, I think, get under the Prime Minister's skin by saying that he wanted to tear up the water agreements between the United States and Canada, which there are many, not just the International Joint Commission Agreement, which was the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, but it's also the Great Lakes Compact and international agreement that were negotiated from 1998 to 2005, and then finally were adopted in the United States in 2008, and Ontario in 2007, and Quebec 2009. These are holier than thou water agreements between the Great Lakes states and the Great Lakes provinces. And I think what happened was, in the process of trying to rattle Prime Minister Trudeau, President Trump also rattled his citizens in the Great Lakes region who have spent years negotiating and worshiping these agreements with Ontario and Quebec. And so he's seemed to have backed off on that. But the other thing is that the agreements prompted the states in the United States to create the Great Lakes Compact and prompted the province of Ontario and Quebec to ban water diversions from the Great Lakes as well. And so now that work has been done, we have a compact in the United States, we have agreements in Ontario and Quebec. This is a legal water fence that prevents water from being taken out of the Great Lakes watershed, period, with very limited local exceptions. And so you could tear up the agreement between the United States and Canada on that, but the laws are now in place, and it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to rewind those laws on the U.S. side, and it'd be extremely difficult to unwind those laws on the Canadian side. So it was a lot of bluster. As I say in my talks, I give book talks all over the North America, that just don't take the bait on this one. It's not going to happen. You tear up the agreement between the United States and Canada, the lakes are still safe from long-range, large-scale diversions because of the warm, strong binational relationship that exists between the 8 Great Lakes states and the provinces of Ontario and Quebec.
And we talk a lot on this podcast. We deal with a lot of Indigenous people and topics, right? Because it's such a there's a lot of focus on that, especially in Canada with Truth and Reconciliation, and just a lot of what we do with the outdoors and stuff. It's always affecting someone, Bill, as you always say. It's always affecting something. And I wanted to get a bit of an American take on this, and because I just don't know how different the relationship that our government has with Indigenous peoples versus your government with Indigenous people. And just what does that look like in and around the Great Lakes? Are there any treaties and all that kind of stuff or is there a
duty
focus,
to consult?
A duty to consult? Anything in terms of protecting some of those Indigenous lands?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a complicated question, a complicated answer. So I live on the south shore of Lake Superior and am blessed to be living in, communities that have tribes and reservations, which is the way we refer to them in the United States, as opposed to First Nations and reserves in Canada. And so there are numerous treaties with each of these tribes, and that the tribes are considered sovereign governments, and there are continuing negotiations over issues and sometimes litigation over issues involving those tribal governments. But we have the same tradition of a land acknowledgement before we have public addresses and things like that, which is very common, as you know, in Canada, and I'm quite certain originated in Canada, frankly, that tradition. So they have treaty rights and extensive treaty rights in many cases on the U.S. side as well. But it is a situation that can ebb and flow with changes in government. And so there has been some backpedaling, if you will, under the current administration in the United States. So we have a Bureau of Indian Affairs on the United States side, and our local office of Bureau of Indian Affairs, which has been in existence for decades, if not more than a century, is on the list for closure now, which has been seen as a slap in the face of Indigenous people in my community here. But the treaties are treaties, and they are seriously upheld by courts in the United States. And there's regular litigation under those treaty rights to ensure that they are enforced and that they're not weakened. And that's, of course, undertaken by the tribes themselves.
The Great Lakes Water Wars was published in 2006, second edition, 2018, and you just brought us up to speed with regards to, Trudeau and then Carney and President Trump. But in that 7 years, what other things have you learned that we should keep our eyes on with regards to For instance, one thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about, we never saw cruise ships on the Great Lakes. And now there's cruise ships on the Great Lakes, and we can talk about invasive species, which you do in the book, et cetera, all kinds of environmental impacts. But I just wondered, as time marches on, nothing really stops when we talk to impacts on the environment.
No, it's absolutely true. And I think the key thing from a water quantity standpoint, right? The book is primarily, let's keep Great Lakes water in the Great Lakes watershed where it belongs. Let's bring the jobs to the water rather than send the water to jobs somewhere else, et cetera. And then the other kind of key tenet under the Great Lakes Compact is that the vast majority of the water is for the environment. And what we've seen in other watersheds throughout North America is that not necessarily been the priority. It's been the water's been prioritized for people over the environment, and that's just a losing proposition over the long term. So on a water quantity standpoint, what we have seen is the climate-driven water crisis has become much, much worse, particularly in the American Southwest. The Colorado River watershed, the most oversubscribed watershed in the United States, if not the entire continent, it no longer flows regularly to the ocean because humans pull out all the water for agriculture, industry, and to drink. And they are now in what's called a mega drought, a new term that has emerged, the worst drought in 1,200 years. 40 million people are dependent on that river. And they are now, the state of Arizona has been talking about possibly, and in sort of an emergency situation, embarking on long-range, large-scale water diversions from the Mississippi River, which has not nearly the quantity of the Great Lakes, but thanks to those agreements I talked about earlier, the Great Lakes are off limits. You can't even ask or think or talk about, well, you can talk about it, but it's not going to happen because of the laws that the citizens and politicians in the Great Lakes region put into place, and like I said, in the 2007 to 2009 timeframe. And so the water diversion monster continues to raise its head under this crisis, but the lower 48 states, there's a smattering of water tension throughout that area. So the water quantity tension has increased, which shows how prescient the premiers and governors and their staffs and the citizens in the Great Lakes region were in adopting the Great Lakes Compact and the international agreements to ban water diversions from the Great Lakes. The invasive species issue is never going to go away. And it's just not. And all we can do is try and to limit it as much as possible. So the ballast water attention, both by the federal governments, the United States and Canada, our Coast Guards are all over trying to test ballast water when it comes into the Great Lakes region from salties, cruise ships, et cetera. And there's a complicated system where they check the salinity before those ships come in to make sure that it's solid ocean water that things cannot live in, that would be necessarily freshwater species that would maybe thrive in the Great Lakes region. And so they have to discharge that ballast water on the high seas, and the Coast Guard, like I said, and coming in the St. Lawrence Seaway, they check that. And we're seeing concerns about data centers now and artificial intelligence and the demand. It's taxing energy supplies on both sides of the international border in the Great Lakes region. There's concerns about the taxing on water supplies, but what we're seeing is that the industries want to have sort of blue ribbon environmental records for stockholders, and especially young stockholders, that there are new generation of retirement stockholders in North America. They want to invest in companies that are green and are sustainable. And so what we're seeing is that the data center industries, these big tech companies, are doing water recycling. They're not just pumping and dumping, they're pumping it and then recycling it again and again and again before they discharge it to try to reduce the concerns about water consumption. Because if there was a region that should have data centers that are water intensive, it should be the Great Lakes region, but that doesn't mean that water should be wasted. And so what we're seeing is this sort of culture, both in the companies and by the regulators, to make sure that that water is used sustainably when it is used.
Yeah, one of the questions I had as a professor, one of the courses you teach is in reporting and writing How do you get these young minds to dig? Because you have to dig, you have to be committed to the cause. And I thought that's a question I had to ask in one of my questions.
Yeah, sure. It's we live in an impatient time. The attention spans are short. And if you have a short attention span, especially when it comes to research and digging, you're going to miss stuff. And you're probably going to miss the biggest stuff. And so you have to kind of teach a more patient, deliberate, in the old way back in the last, they called it muck raking. You had to rake through the muck and then you'd get the stuff. And that's hard work, raking. Who wants to wallow in the muck, right? Nobody wants to, but that's where the big stories and the most important stuff can be there. So it's trying to get them to slow down. It's trying to get to slow down their attention span. That's tough. But then on the other hand, the demands on those of us, whether it's podcasts or books or whatever, we really have to keep it fast moving and interesting if it's going to be longer, because these attention spans are short. So yeah, I have I have students who work for me, and I have them peer review my work and make sure that it meets their high standards on their attention spans as well. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, Ben, over to you. I cut you off there.
No, it's all good. Just so people can understand the importance of the Great Lakes, if the Great Lakes were to, let's say, dry up or something happened where we couldn't pull from them or whatever, or we couldn't use them, outside of obviously the drinking water aspect, how would that shake the economies of both Canada and the U.S.?
Well, the single largest use is agriculture. And so, if you look at, all that ag, and particularly in southern Ontario, a lot of the greenhouse ag industry down there, right in there with agriculture is power generation. And I'm not just talking about the power generation on the St. Lawrence that we referenced earlier, but all of the power generation, whether it's coal-fired, natural gas, nuclear power, et cetera, those are super heavy water-intensive industries, and they evaporate a lot of Great Lakes water that in some cases will then rain back down into the Great Lakes watershed. Other cases, it will evaporate into other watersheds. So all of that would come to a halt. And so if you don't have, and this is something that's called the water, food, energy nexus, they're all related. And so, if you don't have water and you don't have food and you don't have energy, then you're done, right? I mean, you can't do anything. And another sort of statistic to show the magnitude of the lakes is that according to the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, if you were to take all the water of the Great Lakes and spread it out over the lower 48 states in the United States, it would cover them in 10 feet of water.
Yeah, it's like that movie with Meryl Streep. It's complicated. But I wanted to read, from the last paragraph in your prologue. Today, when I stand on the shores of Lake Superior, I don't see a lake. I see a sprawling deep blue battleground that stretches from Duluth, Minnesota to Trois-Rivières, Quebec. I wonder who will win the war. Maybe some impressions about that since you started to research 2 editions of the book and all the other things that where we're headed and where this is going to go as far as an environmental topic and issue.
Yeah, really great question. And here's the latest edition that you talked about from 2018. It's the gray blue edition. It's got a picture of Chicago on the front, and now we know the significance as to what we talked about. But I think, and I wrote that passage, which is a very popular passage. It's just a couple pages in the front, at a time when the Great Lakes Compact and the agreements with Ontario, Quebec had not passed yet, and it was a really important, serious, unnerving question as to whether or not the people in the Great Lakes region, again, 2 amazing Canadian provinces, 8 amazing states, the tribes and the First Nations being consulted regularly throughout, could they do it? Could they create this legal water fence that's designed to keep Great Lakes water inside the Great Lakes watershed? And remarkably, in 4 years, they did. They did it. They adopted it. They passed it on both sides of the border with the approval of the tribes and First Nations, et cetera. And it just, so I guess the answer to that great question, Bill, is that the people in the Great Lakes region have won the war. They have protected their signature natural resource, the Great Lakes, that hold 20% of all the fresh surface water on the planet. And when I give my talks, I say, think about this, right? Is that you have a binational, bipartisan agreement adopted in the absence of a crisis on behalf of future generations. When is the last time on either side of the border you have been able to string those words together? And it is truly remarkable what the people in the Great Lakes region have done to protect their signature resource.
Yeah, I don't know, almost like an amen to that, Dan.
What is, I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. What is the most important lake out of the 5?
Oh, well, I have 5 kids and I love them all.
But in terms of like importance to like what we were talking about, like agriculture, drinking water, all that stuff, is there one that's a little bit more important than the other ones?
I mean, it's hard to argue against the idea that the Headwaters Lake is, the most important lake. I mean, Lake Superior holds more water than the other 4 lakes combined. And it is the largest lake by surface area in the world. It is the cleanest, the clearest, the coldest. And so, again, even way down in Lake Ontario, even in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, I think people would agree that if you were to lose the robustness in the Headwaters Lake, everyone downstream is going to suffer.
Yeah. Amazing. I think, as I think every year in my adult life, I think I've been in Lake Superior. So this year when I dip my toe in or whatever I do along the shores of Lake Superior, I'll be thinking of you in this book. And thank you for being on the Backroads Bill podcast.
Well, big thank you to Peter for coming on the podcast. It'll be an interesting topic, actually, to keep your eye on as, again, political tensions being what they are right now. You never know what's going to happen, but it does sound like there are a lot of ironclad agreements in place to stop anything too bad, too drastic from happening. But you never know. And it was great having Peter on, who literally, again, as I said at the top of the show, he wrote the book on it. He was able to shed some light, give some expertise on this topic, and really talk about how important these bodies of water are to us. Not just, again, from what they give you at face value, but all of the stuff that they do around, the agriculture, all of this stuff that's so important, and how they tie into our ecosystem is incredibly important. So if you enjoyed this episode, you can find more episodes of the Backroads Bill podcast on your favorite podcast players. We are, of course, available on Apple, Spotify. The video version is on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel. Of course, you can find every episode on northbayecho.ca, with new episodes dropping every single Wednesday, usually in the morning, sometimes a little bit later in extreme circumstances, but every single Wednesday, a new episode of the Backroads Bill podcast. I think we have episodes right now up until mid-August. We have a lot in the bag, a lot of great ones coming up, including next week when we're going to be talking to Sean Lahi and Lauren Anderson, who are doing the Yukon 1000. So, if you thought the Mattawa canoe race was long at 64 kilometers, this one's about 10 to 15 times longer, about over 10 days. It's crazy, but they're getting prepped for that. We had a great sit-down conversation. We're going to bring them in again at the end of the month, at the end of July, early August, to get the reaction and how that went. That's going to be a fantastic episode. So that'll be next Wednesday, right after Canada Day, that you'll be able to catch that one. And of course, go over to northbayecho.ca to find out all of the other great podcasts that we have. So that wraps things up here for us. Join us again next week for another Backroads adventure.